It is a great pleasure to introduce Jenny Kendler as our first visiting artist in residence for the 2017-18 visiting artist season. I first got to know Jenny when we both attended Acre residency almost 10 years ago in rural Wisconsin. During the residency, we went on many walks through swamps, cornfields, and I got to watch Jenny make her work in action. I believe there was some swamp swimming for a photography project that involved submersion in swamp mud. Needless to say, Jenny is completely dedicated to her work and activism, and her passion is contagious. You can't help but be more aware of our world and our environment by spending time with her. Jenny holds an MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and a BFA from the Maryland Institute College of Art. She is vice president of the Artist Residency Acre, co-founder of the artist website service Other People's Pixels, and in 2014 was named the first ever artist in residence with the environmental nonprofit NRDC. Alongside an interdisciplinary team, she was recently awarded a major grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for a community engagement project, Garden for Changing Climate. Jenny has an accomplished exhibition record, including museums and biennials such as the MCA Chicago, Albright-Knox, Pulitzer Arts Foundation, iMOCA, DePaul Art Museum, the California Academy of Sciences, the Chicago Biennial, and the Kochi-Muziris Biennale. She has been commissioned to create public projects for locations as diverse as Philadelphia's Fairmount Chicago Park, Chicago's Lincoln Park Conservatory, Louisville's Riverwalk, an Arizona desert, and a tropical forest in Costa Rica. Jenny is on campus for 3 days working on a project in collaboration with our Prairie manager, Remick Ensweiler, the art faculty, and our students to install a permanent artwork within the Prairie itself. This work will create a literal underground library by burying outdated books on climate change. These projects I bet she'll talk about a little bit more, but we definitely encourage you to participate. This year's Visiting Artist Series highlights artists who are committed to engaging with social and environmental issues. Jenny is the perfect capstone for our series as her work, her life, and her activism demonstrate rigor, commitment, and what I believe to be the strongest form of socially engaged art. Please help me welcome Jenny Kendler.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for showing up on this beautiful September day to listen to me talk about art and environment. I also want to second what one of your professors was saying, please register to vote. It is so absolutely crucial in this day and age. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to just start not too many years ago, back in 2014, and go forward talking about a series of projects that I've done that all deal with art and environmental activism. So in 2014, Mara mentioned really briefly, I was named Artist in Residence with the Natural Resources Defense Council. If you haven't heard of them before, they're one of the country's largest environmental not-for-profits. So they have about 500 employees. They're located in offices all over the country. They even have an office in China. And they do really important work, basically protecting our country's natural resources, things like the national monuments, which are currently under threat by the Trump administration, and the health of our water, the health of our air, the health of our climate. So I was really honored to work in collaboration with them to try to find new ways to translate environmental issues into different ways that we can talk to the public so that we can really kind of get under people's skin in a way that, say, a white paper or maybe a documentary couldn't necessarily. So what I'm going to talk about first is a project that I created in 2014. It was a commission for the Pulitzer Arts Foundation, which is a really beautiful museum in St. Louis. Some of you who were here yesterday may have actually gotten a chance to participate in an iteration of this project. So this is something that I came up with for the museum there, but then has gone on to be sort of reperformed in many different contexts. This is called milkweed dispersal balloons. And yeah, for those of you who were here yesterday, what you saw were these series of biodegradable balloons that are filled with floating, fluffy milkweed seed. Milkweed is really important because it's the only food crop of the monarch butterfly. So it's the only plant on which monarchs can lay their eggs, in which their eggs can pupate, grow into caterpillars, and then become the next generation of butterflies. Monarchs are threatened these days, their populations have been reduced by about 90% in the last few decades. So we're really actually on the verge of losing this incredible species that makes a 3,000-mile migration from Alberta to Michoacan, Mexico each year in a way that scientists are actually only beginning to understand. You know, we're really not even cracking the code of how these supposedly simple butterflies can do these incredibly complicated things. So what we did with this project was we wanted to create an interactive way to get people to really engage with the subject matter in a new way. So we could have been making paintings or drawings or ceramics, all of which I think are like really beautiful and valuable ways to change culture. Myself, I'm really trying to find new and different forms of blending art and activism together where neither the art nor the activism erases each other. And I'm not sure that I'm succeeding, but I'm definitely trying. So in this particular case, we did this project out of a food cart. We took it to the museum. We took it to also a farmer's market. So I was really interested in having this both in an art context where it becomes part of this sort of cultural canon, but also in like a non-art context where it was, to me, is like a little more interesting to work in a way where you're engaging with people in different ways. So this is at the museum and then at the farmer's market. One of the things that I really enjoy about doing this kind of work is being able to engage in conversations with people. So I'm definitively not a performance artist, but I often, as part of my work, am there engaging with people, telling stories and hearing their own stories. So in this particular case, you can see this woman in red here who told me she was in her early 80s. She talked to me about how growing up in the Midwest on a farm, she used to relish the summertime where she would run through these fields of flowers and just see thousands of monarch butterflies. She said, you know, she mentioned them sort of like flying up in front of her, like this path of butterflies, which is a really beautiful, idyllic image. And then she talked about how that phenomenon is really just gone, that she rarely sees them. And she was really excited to be able to take home some milkweed seed because she'd been hearing in the news about the plight of the monarch and wanted to be able to contribute in some way. So this project for me was a way to both engage people in conversation, spread some information, give people like a helpful and cathartic action that they can actually take, but also hopefully like participate in this really beautiful art moment, which is where when you take these balloons, you're supposed to take them home with you. We're not releasing them into the atmosphere, but you take them home with you and you pop them, and there's this like moment where all of the fluff just like shoots out and the seeds spread into the wind. So the next project I want to talk about is called Tell It to the Birds. This was a project that was designed for the Expo Art Fair. So this is particularly for the Natural Resources Defense Council's booth. The Expo Art Fair, if you guys don't know, is an international art fair that's held out on Navy Pier, not otherwise the world's most wonderful venue, but in this particular case, we get about 40,000 people through every year. So again, another chance to really engage with a lot of different people. What we had in this case was an interactive experience where people would encounter this 10-foot geodesic dome. This was covered in 500 thrifted t-shirts that I'd transformed into this feather-like covering because I'm a crazy person. It ended up weighing over 200 pounds, and just a fun behind the scenes, we had to bribe someone from the union to carry it in on a forklift. So when people would encounter this space, you know, the art fair is like this crazy, bustling environment. It's very much commercial art driven. People are seeing $60,000 paintings. Some people are there to buy them. A lot of people, they're just there to appreciate the art. And so I wanted to make something for people to encounter that was really different. But because I knew the way that the art fair operated, that it's this very see and be seen, bright, overwhelming environment, I really wanted to create something that was private, where people could have an authentic experience with something. So this was the interior of the space. So that was my initial driving impetus for creating the work. This is the interior of the space. This is what people would encounter as a custom printed fabric that I made with pictures of lichen that I did in collaboration with 2 lichenologists that are located at the Field Museum in Chicago. This is a scented lichen dish, so when you would approach it, it smells like the forest. And people were looking at this field guide here, which shows, you saw that there's some sculptural work on the walls around it too. So this shows not only the sculptural work on the walls, but it also shows 11 very real birds. These were all birds that are threatened by climate change, like the rufous red knot, or they're threatened by tar sands expansion, or they're threatened by habitat loss. And so as people were waiting in this long line to experience the piece one at a time, they were able to look at these birds, and we asked them to choose one that they identified with. Once they're inside the space, they're prompted to make a confession to the natural world or tell a secret. You can see there's a microphone hidden inside of this dish here. And we used some custom audio processing software that made it completely impossible for anyone to hear or record the secret that people told, because we wanted them to really have true privacy. But the words that they spoke were then translated into the song of the endangered bird that they had identified with while they were waiting. So they both heard their words come back to them as the song of a bird, and also that was broadcast to everybody else. And I didn't really know what to expect in this art fair environment, but it ended up being a really poignant experience. We had a lot of people come out with tears streaming down their face. One older gentleman said that he wanted to tell me what he had spoken, and he talked about how when he was a young boy that he had killed a robin for fun without like really thinking about it, which I think, something, it takes children a while to learn how their impacts affect the world, and that he was glad to like get that weight off of his chest. So people interacted with it in really different ways though. Some people laughed and found it joyous. There was one of the birds that's a prairie chicken, which has this like beautiful chortling laughter-like call. So this was a really interesting experience to see like what the audience kind of brought to it. So next I want to talk about, I'm jumping ahead in time a little bit, but I want to keep the thread of talking about birds and bird calls and sound art. So I'm working in really all different kinds of medium. You can see that I really sort of, as a conceptual artist, let the medium kind of come after the concept as opposed to the other way around. So, and recently I've been working with sound a lot. And I think that that's because I feel like in our sort of visually overstimulated world that sound is this like other way to get us to really tap into and listen to our senses, to kind of engage with our senses in a new way, which is something that's really important and interesting to me, is this kind of retuning of the way that we're interacting with the natural world, and kind of a reset. Because I believe that we all do have this inherent desire to have a relationship with the natural world. It's like, I mean, there's nothing more natural for a biological animal that evolved in nature than to have a relationship with the environment that you're supposed to be contextualized within. So oftentimes that's what I'm trying to do with my pieces. In this particular case, this is a project that was at the Lincoln Park Conservatory. It was a commission by the Experimental Sound Studio. For those of you guys who don't know, this is a really amazing resource in Chicago for anyone who's interested in experimental sound or music. It's located in Chicago's North Side, and they do programming all the time, so you can Google them. But they have had this long-standing collaboration with the Chicago Parks District, which is really quite extraordinary to think about the Parks District for, I believe, 16 years, taking a risk to put experimental sound installations in the Lincoln Park Conservatory, which of course is one of the biggest public and tourist attractions in the city. So these are here all the time. Anytime you go to the conservatory, it's open all the time, it's free, and you'll find rotating group of artists whose work is being shown there. But in this particular case, this was a collaboration between myself and my husband, who's also a sound artist. And what we did, we wanted to really deal with the subject material of the room itself. It's a fern room. Some people, have tended to do these kind of abstract sonic compositions, but we said, we want to deal with what's here. We want to really engage with what's going to be right in front of people's faces. And so we also had this tongue-in-cheek idea that what people might expect to hear there is a nature soundtrack. It seems like the most obvious thing to hear chirping birds and flowing water. So we said, yeah, we want to do that, but we're going to change it in a way that's really unexpected. So we used a custom piece of audio processing software that transforms photographs into sound. So we took photographs of the ferns themselves after having noticed that ferns, their waveform sort of looks like their shape sort of looks like the waveform that's created by a bird call. So we took these photographs of ferns and transformed them into calls of birds by initially creating this set of tones from the photographs and then manipulating them to sound like bird calls. And then to make it even more fun, we sort of created this magical realism story that went around it and put signage in the space that would kind of confuse people as to like what was real and what was fantasy, very much in the tradition of Borges. So continuing with the theme of birds, this is another project that I worked on that was that really is like another thread that I've continued with in my practice, which is participatory projects where the work itself is actually created in collaboration with the public. Again, you'll notice this thread that I hope at least is running through my work of gift giving, generosity, openness. I think that that kind of radical generosity is really appealing to me as a way to open doors for people to have access to the work. So in this particular case, this project is called 1 Hour of Birds. It's a collaborative photography project that started as a prompt to the public to watch birds for 1 hour through the lens of a camera. So it could be, you know, I had professional photographers and I had people with iPhones. So this particular one was made by me sitting next to a hummingbird feeder up at Acre, the artist residency that Mara and I were at together. This one was made by a professional photographer who lives in Florida, who told me he was really in a rut with his practice and was really glad to participate in something that sort of shook things up. So what you're looking at is a compilation of every single image that the person took over the course of an hour. So the prompt is, sit somewhere where you see birds against a kind of neutral background, the sea, the sky, point your camera up at the sky and just use the camera as a kind of disembodied eyeball. So often I think that we find our devices, our cameras, like desensitizing us to the world around us. But I want to think of them as a way to actually like resensitize or enhance our senses to make us look more deeply and more carefully. So in this case, the camera became this excuse for an intensive hour of meditative, quiet engagement with the natural world. So this one was so I asked people to submit every single photograph to me that they take during the hour, no matter whether it's blurry or they don't think it's a great photo. And then I combine them together to create one single record of this hour. In this particular case, I got an email from a young woman who lived in Brooklyn, and she said, sorry, I tried to participate in your project, but it didn't work. I laid on my roof and not a single bird flew over. And I said, oh, did you take at least one picture of the sky though? And she said, oh yeah, I did. I said, perfect. So this is just an example of what the images look displayed together, and this is an ongoing collection that people can continue to participate in. Everyone is completely credited, I consider, like each and every image made in collaboration with the other artist, and so that person's name is carried along with the piece wherever it goes. So that is to say, if any of you would like to participate, there's information on my website, and I would love to see some more images from you guys. This was at the Indianapolis Museum of Contemporary Art. So I want to talk about prairies. I'm going to talk about prairies to you guys in person in your very own prairie coming up soon, which is, I just cannot emphasize enough how special that is, that there's a piece of prairie on the campus here. I'll talk about this more in detail during the walk, but Illinois was once 60% prairies. Now we have 0.01% remaining, so that is 1/10,000th of what was left, or what existed before. So prairies are really one of the most globally endangered ecosystems. And so although I think if you're on the campus, it might seem quite normal that you have some prairie around you here, it's actually extraordinarily rare. And it's a lot of work for the people who try to maintain the prairie. So that's one reason I was really excited to come out and do a project with you guys here. This project is called A Place of Light and Wind for Lost Prairies. So as someone who grew up on the East Coast, it took me a little while to learn how to see the prairie. I think I had a misconception of what this wilderness that was like primarily grasses and flowers would be like, coming from being someone who grew up in the forest. So I thought of this idea of this place of light and wind, or really trying to think of this as like it is a forest in and of itself, really. That actual tall grass prairies, which are what was once in Illinois, are many feet above your heads, and they really are these kind of seas, a sea of flowers and a sea of colors that changes throughout the seasons. This particular project was for the Violet Hour, which is a James Beard awarded speakeasy that's in the city of Chicago. It's a great location for a mural because it gets a lot of foot traffic. It's right near one of the main train line stops. So this is a 38-foot mural that you can see is composed entirely of photographs, thousands of photographs that almost crashed my computer, of prairie flowers. So what I realized is most people who live in Illinois have never seen a prairie before. And I wanted to give them a sense, especially in these winter months, of this like overwhelming beauty of being immersed in this field. You'll also notice that if you see on the B here, there's a QR code that's placed there. So that was so that passersby with their cell phones can scan those with the QR reader, and that'll sign them up to be on a list to get free prairie flower seeds in the mail. So the concept of the piece was really to give people this kind of sensuous immersion in this field of color, but then make the mural real to like actually create miniature prairies in backyards and planters all across the city of Chicago. And we also had the speakeasy actually let me design some cocktails in collaboration with them. So we created some drinks like Heavy Petal and Hive Minded that were all using petals and bee pollen and honeycomb. And we did a fundraiser to raise funds for threatened prairies. So this is a project that came out of that one. This was a curator from the Albright-Knox Museum, which is this really beautiful, proper white marble columns museum that's in Buffalo, New York. I was contacted by their curator of public art, who asked me to take the project that he'd seen from the Violet Hour and adapt it for the city of Buffalo. So in Buffalo, there are a lot of recent immigrants who he was really interested in trying to figure out a way to reach out to them. So again, like I mentioned, one reason I really like to work outside of the gallery is because not everybody knows that art galleries are for them. Not everybody feels welcome. And so he was very aware of this, working in public art, and wanted to create a project where we were actually putting the work in the communities. In this particular case, what we did was we adapted these newspaper boxes that were donated by the local paper. I changed the pattern to be all flowers that were local to the Buffalo environment. And then we created these little seed packets that you can say it says Rewilding New York, but you have to look really closely to see it. Again, this kind of close attention to detail is something that's really important to me in my work. You'll see that I want to oftentimes kind of reward the close viewer, someone who's more attentive. So we gave away over 1 million individual wildflower seeds in 10,000 packets, where they were hosted by different local organizations. So each one belonged to an organization who tended the little green roof on top of it and interacted with their community in giving these out. And so our hope was, there was a lot of information inside this little card too that talked about creating habitat for pollinators and creating, urban beautification, and also bringing back the plants that were once everywhere in these urban environments, but have been largely extirpated by human concepts like pavement and lawn. So another project that I did with plants, this is called Field of Vision, A Garden for Others. This is a project that was a commission by the city of Louisville, who was doing a revitalization of their Riverwalk. You can kind of see in the background here that there's a little piece of highway, which is a really poor urban planning choice that was made in the 1970s, where they essentially built the city, but then cut it off from this otherwise really beautiful waterway with a passive highway. Now, probably my theory is that's because in the 70s, the river was probably a lot less appealing. You guys may be familiar with, the rivers that caught fire in the United States in the 70s. And thank goodness, since the advent of the Clean Water Act, our riverways have gotten a lot better. As a small side note, this might be interesting to you guys, that the Clean Water Act, you guys have probably heard about this. It's along with the Clean Air Act and the Endangered Species Act, these are the main pieces of legislation that protect our environment in the United States. These are things that, for example, organizations like NRDC are using all the time in order to sue the government or sue corporations to protect our resources. But the very interesting thing is that these pieces of legislation are really reviled now by a lot of people. People in our government currently are trying to dismantle them. But at the time that they were created in the 1970s, they were actually completely supported by bipartisan administration. So these were passed under Nixon, and it was like every single Republican, every single Democrat voted for these pieces of legislation. So I want to pose the question to you to try to think about what changed and why. And why are we in a climate now where people are not valuing clean water and are not valuing clean air? Doesn't that seem like something that everybody should want? So in this particular case, now the rivers are a little bit healthier. Cities are starting to change their minds and want people to come down to these areas and see them. So they wanted to create some public art there that would get people around. In this particular case, I started to think about how I oftentimes want to make work not just for a human audience, but also for a non-human audience. So I designed a garden that was specifically, as you can see, it's called A Garden for Others. The garden was actually designed for pollinators, so less so for human beings. And I used this idea of what was attractive to pollinators, what was attractive to butterflies, to make every single choice that went into the plantings that were all native plants, all high nectar yielding. And you can see that it was immediately really successful. The day that we put the plants in, we had butterflies all over them. 4 days later, we had baby caterpillars, monarchs on our milkweeds. But I didn't want this to just be for pollinators. I wanted to think about how human beings might try to understand pollinators a little bit more too. So we think of butterflies, moths, sometimes it's just as bugs, right? Or maybe we think of them as kind of a decoration for our world. But of course, or we think of Hallmark cards. But of course, they're actually beings with their own internal sense of experience of what their lives are. What that experience is, I think, is like impossible for us to know, but maybe really compelling to imagine. And so that's what I wanted to do with this project. And by I took, you might have seen the solar powered lights that are in the planters. I opened all those up, I hacked them and changed them so that they're emitting ultraviolet light instead. So ultraviolet light, because pollinators, butterflies in particular, actually see well into the ultraviolet spectrum. Human beings like to think that we're superior in all ways to other creatures, especially something like a bug. But actually butterflies have 5 cones in their eyes, we only have 3, and so can see colors that we can't even begin to imagine. Like what comes after purple? You can't even think about it, right? But these creatures are experiencing this on a day-to-day basis and using it to find food. What I wanted to do was use ultraviolet light at night to give human beings an experience of what it might be like to see in butterfly vision. Of course, we can't actually know what that is, but it created a space that was for pollinators during the day and human beings at night. And within a few days, we had people walking, the 5 minutes under the underpass from their offices to come and have lunch. They're spending more time around the wild areas, and we had butterflies stopping through too. This is a project that was for the Museum of Contemporary Art here in Chicago. You guys have been to this museum maybe? There's a lot of interesting work up there right now. Actually, an artist that I think is probably one of the most interesting artists to me working in Chicago right now, Michael Rakowitz. So I would really recommend you going to see his show. He has a retrospective up there now with a lot of really beautiful work that very much is in line with the program that Mara has helped design about socially engaged art. So this is a project called People's Porfiry. Porfiry is a type of stone, actually. Some people would consider it an extinct stone, which is a strange idea maybe, but what it means is a stone that no longer exists in the natural world. It's all been mined out. It was a type of purple marble that was really popular with the Roman emperors and was basically mined out by them, but became this symbol of wealth. So you guys may be aware of this association between the color purple and royalty or wealth or imperialism. That's where that association comes from, both from the porphyry and also from a particular type of purple dye, Tyrolean purple. So as time went on, this obsession continued despite the fact that the stone was no longer available in the natural world. Napoleon actually was obsessed with the idea of being buried in a porphyry coffin and sent a team of people to try to rediscover this lost vein of stone in Egypt. He failed, and he was buried instead in an imitation porphyry coffin. And so you see this idea even of imitation porphyry continues throughout the ages. And we have Victorians. You can look back in auction catalogs and you'll find tables and ceramics that are made to be mock porphyry because they want to adopt this symbol of empire, of wealth, of imperialism. So I wanted to design a new kind of porphyry. I wanted to make a people's porphyry. And that's what we did at the MCA. We used beet juice for the color. Nothing more organic than that. And we pulped Wall Street journals and Sotheby's catalogs to create a paper pulp, which we impregnated with natural wildflower seeds to make seed bombs. So visitors to the museum got a chance to get their hands messy and go home with a whole series of little seed bombs that they were tasked to throw into vacant lots as they left the museum for the day. We also did another project that was that same idea of spreading seeds, but with a little bit of a different context. This is called Herd Not Seen. So the herd that's not seen anymore, haha, my clever pun, is bison. Bison were once 50 million strong. They lived all across this area of the country in the Great Plains. And they, just like us, were ecosystem engineers. So that means that they were changing the environment in ways that were beneficial to them, but were also beneficial to a great host of other creatures. Bison help to aerate the soil. They keep invasive species down. They create wallows, which then become vernal pools that are critical for supporting animal life, like amphibians and insects. But by the turn of the century, their populations were reduced again to just a handful. Sorry, you're going to keep hearing the same sad story from me. Hundreds, maybe thousands, but not very many were left. These days, the only wild herds really live around Yellowstone. We're lucky enough in our state to have 2 places where you can see bison, both of which are fabulous field trips if you feel like taking one, which is the Neshusa grasslands down in the south of the state, which is really beautiful prairie remnant, and then the Midewin National Tallgrass Prairie, which is actually quite close to here. It's really feasible as a day trip, and that's a massive prairie restoration project where they're really trying to put in a lot of work to bring this area back to what it once was and give a sense of the kind of grandeur that used to exist in these prairie lands. But what you're looking at here is a series of slip cast ceramics. So those of you who work in the ceramics program, you might know about slip casting. It's a really easy way to make multiples. In this particular case, I didn't fire the ceramics, and that was intentional because I wanted them to actually melt in the rain. So they're covered in native wildflower seeds. And then somewhat unusually for the museum, people were invited to not only touch these, but actually take them home with them. So every single bison was adopted by a person and was taken home. And what I asked in return, again creating a kind of collaborative exchange, was that they send at least one photograph of what happened to their bison as it biodegraded. So this is one of them that somebody sent back of it sitting in their backyard. I think this was just a few weeks later. This is another project that uses the same concept of biodegradability. This one actually began before the Bison project, but took me so long to figure out how to do that I created this sort of micro iteration of it in the meantime. This is actually going on right now, and in fact next week I will be installing the final group of these sculptures. This is an image from the first group. This was a commission from the Chicago Parks District, and there's been a series of 12 of these, one for each month, but they were installed in 3 groups on the solstice and equinox of each season of the year. These ones were obviously the ones from the winter. So these are Venus de Milos. They're cast entirely from soil, seeds, biodegradable materials, and the idea is that in the elements, these crumble, grow plants, go back to the earth, both referencing, sort of tongue-in-cheek idea of how maybe, this is the kind of archetypal image of classical Western art. So I wanted to think maybe about how maybe we can't actually outdo nature. What nature provides is more beautiful than even our most precious art objects. But also this is a comment on how we all go back to the earth, right? All of our bodies will eventually return to the soil and become something new. I loved when I found this one that her face was kind of coated in this beautiful white mold. These are the ones from the summer. This is at the Burnham Wildlife Corridor, which is another area of really gorgeous restored prairie where you can walk or run along the Chicago lakeshore. And it's this real haven for birds and wildlife. It very much matters, even these tiny scraps of prairie, because especially along the Chicago lakeshore, this is a major migration corridor for birds. And so every little place that they can stop matters. These echinacea are really rich and full of seeds, and I'm sure at this time of year have been picked clean by goldfinches. This is a project that I created for the California Academy of Sciences and also the San Luis Museum of Art. It's called Bewilder, Deimatic eye spot camouflage. So deimatic camouflage is a type of camouflage that is a little bit less talked about than the type of camouflage you might be used to, which means blending into something. Deimatic camouflage is actually a startled technique that's used by reptiles, all kinds of insects, and especially by butterflies. So you may be familiar with the types of butterflies that you'll see that will have what's called cryptic camouflage on the exterior of their wings, so that when their wings are closed, they're browns and mottled colors that are blending into the background. But then, let's say a bird gets too close, sees them, approaches, what they'll do is snap their wings open, and the inside of their wings are these brilliant colors with eye spots on them. So we're not, as scientists are not entirely sure why a lot of butterflies do this, but what we think is that these eye spots mimic the eye spots maybe of a predator like a snake that might be threatening to the bird, although there's still a lot of mystery there to be figured out. But what I wanted to think about was how we human beings could maybe use this type of camouflage strategy for our own purposes, and what might we need to hide from. So what you're looking at here is a series of photographs that I took. They're portraits of people up against this huge wallpaper background. In this particular case at the museum, it was 9 feet by 12 feet, composed of thousands of eye spots cut out from photographs of butterflies and moths. So it becomes this sort of horror vacui of endless repetition of these eye spots, like the most startling it could possibly get. And visitors are asked to take this fabric drape and get some temporary tattoos that allow them to apply the eye spots on their face. And what this is doing, so these are portraits that I took while I was in residence at the museum, but people are also taking them with their cameras all the time, so taking selfies or taking pictures of each other. And what these eye spots are doing is actually confusing facial recognition software. So the idea is that they can post this photo on the internet and say Facebook's algorithms won't be able to recognize them because these startling marks confuse the software that has to recognize the placement of the eyes. And that's a project that continues to be restaged too. So a lot of these, because they're actually very lightweight, essentially, they're things that I can give components of them to other people who are interested in it. I really think of a lot of my projects as open source, so that I don't feel a particular sense of ownership or need to control the idea. In fact, I'd rather have it spread. So same thing with the milkweed dispersal balloons project. That project has been replicated by countless groups, from school groups to a wedding to a brownie troupe, who I've put information out there that they can contact me. I'll give them a supply set list and tell them kind of how to best replicate the project for their situation. This particular piece is called Music for Elephants. It was created for Art Prize, which is a big festival in Grand Rapids, and for also the MCA Chicago, the Museum of Contemporary Art. What you're looking at here is a 1921 vintage player piano. Player pianos work by a technology you guys may be familiar with, where they play a perforated roll of paper using a pneumatic system. They actually are a very early digital technology, if you think about it in that way. And they were able to play music with no human pianist. So they have this really kind of ghostly presence to them, I think, that most people associate with them. What I wanted to think about was the material that this piano is made out of. So until the 1970s, the West was importing a lot of ivory to create instruments like pianos. We no longer do this. There's like an ivory ban in the majority of Western countries, and now there continues to be problems with ivory poaching in the East. And I want to specifically say that we ourselves are not blameless in this country. So elephants, African elephants, are again, like many other species, getting pushed to the brink. There's a very real possibility that within our lifetimes, we could lose these unbelievably magnificent creatures from our planet. Can you imagine this moment of picking up the newspaper and reading that elephants are gone, that your children will never see them? I was obsessed with thinking about this kind of heartbreaking moment and wanted to create a piece that could help people emotionally understand what that might be like. So This piece is, you can see that this piano has ivory keys. And what the piece is a score that I created using an algorithm that I wrote based on data of elephant poaching. So I've got access through NRDC actually to this behind the scenes data on how many elephants are being killed by poachers each month, which the numbers are staggering. It averages, I think, about 1,116. And just as a point of reference, there's about 400,000 African elephants remaining, although there were once many millions. So I translated this information, this data about poaching, into a score where, because numbers and music are actually really closely related, I'm essentially playing the music of these elephant deaths on the piano, on the ivory keys that are, of course, the cause of their deaths. And the score plays for the equivalent of 25 years into the future, although it's an accelerated time scale. It takes about 10 minutes, and it falls silent at this moment when there are no more elephants remaining on the planet. I always find that piece a little hard to talk about. This is another project that I'm working on right now. This is called Garden for a Changing Climate. Really I'm going to mostly describe this to you because there's like not a lot to look at yet with this. But last summer, Lorelei Stort, who's the director of Gallery 400, which is a really fantastic art institution at UIC in Chicago, which focuses especially on socially engaged art again, approached me about applying for a grant from a consortium called Humanities Without Walls, which offers really large-scale grants for collaborative projects in the humanities. In this particular case, their challenge was climate change. And so we thought we could propose a public art project as a centerpiece for this humanities-centered community engagement project that will use this project, which this is really, my project is really in some ways like just a small keystone of the piece that really becomes something much bigger that's closer to activism and community engagement. But what we're doing here is using a series of rolling planters that'll have both native and non-native plants that'll be small, either wheelable, carryable, and we'll be bringing them to Chicago neighborhoods and asking people to engage in these kind of parade-like actions where we're going to walk them from one place to the other. What we're going to be doing is going from south to north, explaining to people the way that ecozones are shifting because of climate change. So as the world warms, of course, species are going to be moving northwards to accommodate the increasing heat that we're seeing. So they'll be moving northwards in the northern hemisphere, southwards in the southern hemisphere. We, of course, are not sure which species are going to make it or not. Like a lot of plants can't just pick up and move. Animals that live on top of a mountain can't just pick up and move. And human beings, we own houses or we have jobs in certain areas. We're not necessarily going to be able to move if our cities become too at risk because of climate change. This is certainly an interesting time to be thinking about this when we've all been watching the hurricanes in Texas and in Florida and in Puerto Rico right now as we speak. So, which again are not caused entirely by climate change, but the frequency and severity is certainly exacerbated by them. So this project becomes a way to use this small, fun action to engage people in this larger discussion about how climate change is going to tangibly impact them in their Chicago neighborhoods. What we see with the data is that now the majority of people in the United States believe that climate change is real. They believe that it's caused by human beings, so that's making progress, although maybe too slowly. But we have this information gap still, where people don't believe that climate change is going to affect them. Tiny proportions of people, 17%, something like that, think it will affect them. And even smaller proportions of people talk about it with any kind of regularity. So these are sort of the challenges now that we have to deal with. And I thought that this community engagement project could be a way to get people talking about how things are going to work in their neighborhoods. So we're collaborating with a lot of different scientists, different community organizations, the American Indian Institute, the Field Museum, the Keller Science Action Center, to have scientists help us explain to people how drought, how human health impacts are going to be impacting them in their direct situation. This is a project also ongoing. This is an artist book that I'm creating for a piece of threatened forest in Costa Rica. I started working on this project that was commissioned by an American foundation to go down to Nosara, Costa Rica, which is this really unique tropical dry forest ecosystem, and make a piece of art. And that was about the guidance that they gave me. So I went down there willingly, as you might imagine. And I started to learn about what was going on in the community and found that, to me, the most fascinating thing and the thing that seemed to most need to be highlighted and protected was that there were these areas of forest that were protected not by state or national or even local designation, but were protected only by a community association. And they were really the only parcels of undeveloped forest in this area. And what was also interesting is that nobody really seemed to know about them. Lots of people lived there, but people didn't visit these wild areas. So I wanted to design a project that was both going to get people out into these forests and help them see that they needed to be conserved, because there's really constant development pressure there. This is like a very popular area for surfing. A lot of people from the West are coming down there and buying second homes. So it seemed like something that needed to have some light shined on it. So what I ended up doing was creating a community-engaged photography project, so somewhat like the 1 Hour of Birds project. We got meditation professionals and conservation biologists to lead a series of walks over the course of 4 months, bringing jillions of people out into the forest to actually see it for themselves. And we asked them to make one image of their moment of wonder while they were in the forest. So actually, again, using the device as kind of this way to resensitize them to looking. Then we're creating an artist book that's going to be compiling all of the images that we were given, and we'll be selling those books at bookstores across Costa Rica and the United States, and all of the profits of that project are going to get returned to the community organization so that they are going to be able to do the crucial work that they need to do to secure federal protection, which is to win a couple lawsuits and put up some barriers. And so we're hoping to raise $25,000 for them, which is like maybe not that much, but it goes a long way. And then we're here at the project that we were doing here at the College of DuPage. This project is tentatively called the Underground Library. I'm not sure I've settled on the title yet. But what we're doing with this is using a process called biocharring. Biochar is a form of high carbon charcoal that's been a practice that's been practiced by indigenous people for thousands of years in the Amazon basin, but recently has become very much in vogue with the environmental community because of its multiple benefits. So it's a way of making charcoal in a low oxygen environment that preserves the majority of the carbon in whatever the object it is that you're biocharring, which is almost always wood or waste material. But what I realized is that books are also made out of wood. And so we could biochar books. And so what I've been doing is over the last 6 or 8 months since I've known about this project, collecting a library of books on climate change. So these are mostly the defunct books that are library books that are out of circulation. And what I wanted to do was make them useful again. So we're creating actual literal carbon sinks, which are like a carbon sink means like a way to store carbon. And we're gonna be burying them in the earth. So this is a stable form of carbon that will sequester it and keep it out of the carbon cycle, AKA out of like the problem that's causing global warming for thousands of years. I was actually astonished to see that some of the words are still visible on them. They're really beautiful. So here's just a few of all of the crazy things that I'm working on right now. I'm really happy to take some questions if you guys have any.
When you were done with school, where did you start to when you did all this stuff?
Okay, the question was, when I was finished with school, where did I start? Do you mean in terms of like what project, or like how did I kind of get on the track that I'm on now? Yeah. Okay, that's a really good question. So it definitely took me a little while to get my stride after graduate school. I think I knew what I wanted to be making work about because this has been kind of the central and abiding passion of my life. I was raised in a family of environmentalists, but and all my family really are mostly in the sciences and in medicine. But I just came out an artist. Like my second word was picture when I was a baby, and all I wanted to do was draw, 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 draw. So the challenge for me has been to try to figure out how to fit those two passions together. And I guess like the best advice I would give is like I just kept working. Like I just let that passion drive me. So I feel like I was unsuccessful for a while, or like not making things that were as impactful or as well crafted or as serious as I wanted them to be. But I also tried to be ambitious, again, not for like reasons of personal gain, but because I want to make an impact. And so I think that the moment that things really started to change for me was when I like challenged myself to be more ambitious with the scale of my work. So I worked for a long time in like a small scale way that felt very comfortable to me and very controllable, things that I could make just by myself in my own studio. But when I said, like, what if I tried to make something bigger or more impactful, that's when things really changed. Go ahead.
I'm a pagan, so.
Rad.
Awesome. It's weird to hear someone say that, honestly. Like, call me awesome for doing that. So I'm really into environmental work, just because it's very, very important to our religion in the first place. So I don't know really where to start to make a movement as to, like, kind of making nature more important to people and, like, more valued in, like, even religion and, like, culture, and I just don't know where to start. Like, if you have any ideas, that'd be fantastic.
That's a big question. For those of you who couldn't hear, the question was about how do we help people, I would say, remember the importance of nature in their lives. I mean, I think that we need people working in every single field to do this, right? Like I said, I was compelled to be an artist, and so this is like the way that I've decided to try to communicate this. And it's not that I don't have crisis of faith. It's like every morning I'm like, is this what I should be doing? But I feel like, sure, I could just quit and do activism full time, or try to become a conservation biologist, something that's like seems endlessly appealing to me. But I felt like what was most valuable was for me to try to understand the skill sets that I had. So both maybe inherent genetic things that I was born with, but also like, what have I learned over the years? What connections do I have? How can I kind of like use my history and my particular skill set as a force multiplier to be able to make an impact? And so something I like to think about is this idea of trigger points, right? So that you're just one person, or maybe your network of friends is only a few people, but you want to make an impact. Try to like think about what you guys know how to do, and then look at like where you can put a small amount of pressure that will have a large impact. So I guess I would encourage you, I wouldn't tell you to do like any one particular thing, because I think like you need to figure out what's the right way of working for you. But I also would just say, don't give up. You might feel like you're alone in this, but there's movement of literally tens of millions of people all across the globe right now who are trying to like really see the planet around us, to really understand that we are animals who evolved to be part of and to live alongside the natural world, and to really try to understand the others with which we share this planet, and to not just see them as objectified. The butterflies and bears are not going to rise up and have their own civil rights movement. We have to do that for them. So I would just encourage you to not give up, and to know that you're in good company, and keep reaching out and finding those connections. It's really interesting to think about somebody who's an artist but is also strategic, because we don't tend to think of those things as going together, right? We tend to think that like our cultural stereotype of the artist is somebody who's messy and disorganized and can't get anywhere on time. And somebody who doesn't understand science. I want to try to fight those stereotypes. Like I said, my parents are scientists, and so I very much come from a mentality of like the scientific method, analysis, strategy. And I don't think that those things have to be incompatible with creativity. In fact, I think when you're trying to make work that you want to have a social or environmental impact on the world, that's actually a really good way to operate, that we can kind of have a soft strategy that allows us to have a greater reach to our work, or try to like touch people in a particular emotional way. But thank you for letting me know about the paintings of Winston Churchill. I understand what you're saying. You're talking about being trapped by capitalism. I think that's really complicated, and I feel like I'll be hard pressed to address that in a short way, but I will try. I guess what I would encourage is for you to find the ways of working between the cracks. So that we do have a very pervasive economic system in this country, which is, I believe, probably at the root of why we are destroying our planet. You know, capitalism operates on a system of exploitation and externalization of costs. That means that like you can create more and more profit by externalizing the costs over here. What has tended to happen is that we're externalizing costs onto people in other countries. We're externalizing costs onto the natural environment. And so it's creating, if you don't want to participate in that, but you also like don't want to starve, it creates some complications. But I would encourage you that there are ways to operate within this space. The first thing I would say is like, don't shy away from it. I'm glad that you're talking about it and thinking about it, because I think when people who are creative don't think about these types of issues, they tend to get marginalized and become disempowered. So you can be aware and through that empower yourself. So for example, this is just one small example, but my own personal one, I started a software company that makes websites for artists. That's what I do as my job. That allowed me to do something that I thought was beneficial for the world by sharing people's work. It has a low carbon impact, it's not resource intensive, and because I am the boss, I get to do things in a way that I think is ethical. So all of my employees get full health care. They get maternity and paternity leave. I basically run it like we live in a socialist country. So by being self-employed or figuring out a way to employ yourself, it gives you a lot more power to kind of control those variables. But I think the most important thing is like to be aware that this is a challenge that you have to face and just think creatively about the kinds of skills that you have. And just, be aware of not getting sucked into something. It's very easy. I think it's like, you know, to live ethically, that's my own personal view of that. In this climate, it's almost like you're walking on this razor edge where it's so easy to just fall down. You know, it's like there's a much more well-worn path that's very easy to fall into. So I just encourage you to like continually be mindful of how we can be, you know, we can walk more lightly on the earth.